Well, let's welcome Jack again.
Okay. Hi, Jack. Welcome.
I told him just to expect questions from you.
Nice to see you again.
Well, it's nice to see you guys. You want to ask me questions, or should I just blather on?
We'll start with some questions.
Is there anything that you want to say before we start firing at you?
No, just fire away.
So last time we saw you, you talked a lot about the idea of indigeneity and becoming indigenous to an area as opposed to being born indigenous. Can you speak more to that, like for you personally? You're not from here. How would you become indigenous to New Mexico?
Well, there are a lot of different ways to become indigenous to the homeland you select for yourself. Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, October the 3rd, marks my 50th anniversary in this bioregion or homeland. And it's been really good to me. I'd been a jazz player out on the West Coast, but the lure of the American Southwest really reached me in a way that the inside of a smoky nightclub didn't. And so I had to make a huge sense of differentiation between playing jazz for a living or figuring out how to sustain myself in this new homeland, which I came to on October the 3rd, 1962. The light was spectacular. It's still spectacular, but I wish you could have seen it the way I saw it. When you could see mountain ranges 100 miles distant with great clarity. You could actually almost pick out individual trees. And now smog has moved in. In those days, actually, Santa Fe in this region was regarded as having the purest air in the contiguous 48 states, which is an amazing thought when you think about it. I ultimately, in 1965, I mentioned this to you earlier, but I hired on as a fire lookout up in the Jicarilla Ranger District of the Carson National Forest, which is in the northwestern corner of the state. And for my fire lookout, by the way, it had no tower. I was able to gradually get my pickup truck up on top of this rock. And I lived on top of that rock for 100 days and nights a year for a few years. And that's where I established a sense of indigeneity. When you're up there without any of the accoutrement of modern living except a shortwave radio, in case you happen to spot a fire, and there's no house, there's no nothing except you and your pickup truck, and a bunch of books. Every year I'd bring up 25 or 40 books, and that's what kept me company. But gee whiz, when you're out there for that amount of time, and you're listening to the wind, and you're smelling the pine in the air, or whatever wonderful scents come your way, and you're hearing bird cries, and you're seeing distances that are pretty much unimaginable when you don't get out in it, and you're even tasting the dust, you become a part of it, and it becomes a part of you. One of the many, many books that I took with me up on top of that fire lookout was, let's see, first the Arthur Waley translation of the Tao Te Ching, which had always interested me. I first snapped to that book in Big Sur years earlier when I was sitting on a ledge overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Big Sur is a great place to visit if you've never been there. If you have been there, you know what I'm talking about. It's an amazing place where those mountains meet the sea. And it seemed to me that that book, the Tao Te Ching, as well as anything I've ever read before or since, conveyed the sense of the way the spirit of place flows through nature. And if one, as I did get to do, becomes so affiliated with the flow of nature, as you're sitting on top of a rock on top of a mesa looking out, hoping not to spot a smoke, because if I spotted one nearby, that meant I had to go hike over there with a shovel and a Pulaski and a canteen and try to put it out, which was a trip unto its own. Did that a few times. I'll tell you about one of those instances in a little bit, but you really begin to feel the presence of life around you, which becomes even more than the sense of the presence of life. You begin to feel a whole other dimension that within the context of our species and probably some other species resulted in yet another dimension, which is consciousness. And when you start to participate in that level of consciousness, out in it, you suddenly realize that we're all a deep, deep, deep part of nature. And that's the best place to be. All the rest of it is persiflage, better, not all that meaningful. And so what that taught me was to try to understand my relatively brief sense of continuity within the bigger picture. And thus I became indigenous to northern New Mexico.
You mentioned reading a lot of books while you were doing the fire lookout. Could you quote any of those or know any of your favorite quotes from those books?
One of my favorite quotes has actually Walt Whitman. Has always been resist much, obey little. That became the motto of one of my very dearest friend in this lifetime, who's been dead now, 23 and a half years, but he was also a fire lookout and a writer, and you may have read of him at least. He wrote a couple of my favorite books, one of which was entitled Desert Solitaire, and another one is entitled The Brave Cowboy, which became a film called Lonely or the Brave. He also wrote a novel which may soon become a film or may not, called The Monkey Wrench Gang. His name is Edward Abbey. It was. And one of the things that he said to me, he had two mottos. He was also the one that acquainted me with the work of Walt Whitman as much as anybody did, because when Ed was a kid, he would now be 85. But when he was a kid back in Home, Pennsylvania, that's the name of the town, Home, that was his hometown. One of his mottos was resolve. And another one was follow the truth no matter where it leads. That's powerful business. If you can do that, you're among the elevated few of human consciousness. But it's, at any rate, Ed, it's fun to, at this point in time, as I mentioned to somebody, I turned 76 this last July, and I'm still having an extraordinary adventure. I've made friends with some of the most amazing people I can imagine, close friends, close friendships. And all of the people that I really regard in this lifetime as having been really close friends have also been deeply involved in the out of doors. Ed was a fire lookout. Another friend I'm thinking of right now, a poet named Gary Snyder, who wrote one of the great books called The Practice of the Wild. It's a book of essays. I may have mentioned this the other day in class, but that's a fantastic book. But all of them, both of them, all three of us, have been very deeply involved in anarchist thought. Not from the violent point of view. Well, maybe Ed was. But all three of us have studied pretty deeply anarchist philosophy right up to the present day. And I may have mentioned to you in the last class that one of my favorite philosophers, whose collected works I have at home in my bookshelf, was Peter Kropotkin. Kropotkin. He was born into the Russian nobility in the mid-19th century and armed with Darwin, got out of the gentry as fast as he could, became a geographer, and went into Siberia to study mountain ranges, all the while reading Darwin. And after 5 years of this, he started writing some of the most amazing books on contemporary philosophy that I know of. But his magnum opus entitled Mutual Aid, the last page of that particular book, really defines his philosophy. And I'm slightly paraphrasing here, but not much. Evolution of species and culture owe far more to mutual cooperation than mutual antagonism. That's a big thought. The person from whom he assumed the mantle of environmental or anarchist philosopher back in the latter days of the 19th century was a guy named Mikhail Bakunin, who actually fought at the barricades and really resisted any form of government, even violently. My friend Ed Abbey really hearkened to Mikhail Bakunin. Actually, Ed wrote his master's thesis entitled The Morality of Violence, featuring the work or focusing on the work of Proudhon, who actually coined the phrase, "I am an anarchist." He was the first man to say that. William Godwin, George Sorel, Mikhail Bakunin, and Peter Kropotkin. That is major thinking right there. Now, what interests me is how you take that kind of thinking and put it within the context of natural history and see how all of that stuff fits. And so basically,